Thank you, everyone. It's great to see that everybody really wants to hear a little bit more about verification. In fact, you've taken 2 hours of your night to come and learn a little bit more. When we're talking about hearing aids and we're talking about verification, we've gone through a real evolution. And I go back a long time in hearing aids to the time before they had trim pots. I know, it's hard to believe, but there were hearing aids without trim pots. And I think that in the day we thought that we were very good and very technologically advanced. We used to do our audiogram, we used to get our little nail rulers out, we used to write down how much gain we required at 500, 1, 2 and 4. And we had two sorts of hearing aids, the ones that fitted flat losses and the ones that fitted sloping losses. And the technicians would run the hearing aid through the test box and they'd go, okay, this is how much gain you need at each frequency, and they'd flip through the frequency responses and they'd go, oh, this is the hearing aid for you. Then we'd seat the client in the soundproof room, we'd do an aided audiogram, and that was terrific. So I think that hearing aids and verification have come a long way since then. Remember, when a client comes in to see you, are they saying, I want to actually hear in quiet? How many people say that? Not many. How many people say, I want to hear in noise? Most of the people. Do they say, I want to be able to hear pure tones? Do I want to be able to hear speech-weighted noise? No. What do they say? What do they want to hear? Speech. And I think that, by the end of tonight, you'll see that really we've evolved to the point now where we can actually use speech as our stimulus for assessing hearing aids. How many people in the room use insertion gain as their means of verifying hearing aids? Don't be shy. There's still a few people in the room. How many people use speech mapping? And how many people don't do anything? Well, of course you use something. All right. So we know that, we've used NAL RP. So some people don't have very advanced equipment where they're really able to sort of access the newer speech stimuli. We know that people use insertion gain. Does anyone know when insertion gain was developed? 1988. You know what sort of hearing aids they had in 1988? Analogue. Exactly right, Debbie. And so what we're doing is we have now really technologically advanced hearing aids. Adaptive this, adaptive noise reduction, multiple programs, binaural coordination, and yet we're using a way of measuring hearing aids that was developed in the days of the dinosaur when we had analogue hearing aids. Some people use speech mapping, and I actually refer to it as speech mapping. I don't refer to it as live speech mapping because there's a real difference. I know that sort of people just always talk about live speech mapping, but live speech mapping means that you use a live voice. And we know that although there are lots of times when that's really valid, there are times like when you're trying to meet a target, when you need that standardised signal. And so what we use is a recorded speech signal. And when we use a recorded speech signal, we call it speech mapping. And some people do use live speech mapping in their clinics. Who's actually used live speech mapping? Have actually used their voices? So a couple of people. We know that OHS don't like live speech mapping as a form of verification. All right. But in terms of which way you use the other forms, if it's insertion gain or if it's speech mapping, they don't care. As long as what you're doing is providing a known method with a known target, so DSL, NAL 1, NL 2, as long as you have a known algorithm, a known fitting target, then that's fine by OHS. So I think that there's been a lot of talk around about, oh, OHS will only accept insertion gain. Well, that's actually not true. In terms of verifying hearing aids, in the old days we used to do it in the 2cc coupler, and then we developed ways in which we could put probe tubes and probe microphones in the ear, and then we went to insertion gain. And then the next stage of the development has been speech mapping. So we started off with a very rigid 2cc coupler. And they said, well, you know, that's not quite exactly the volume that you use with different sorts of configurations. And so once they started to develop custom hearing aids, they had to then look at other shapes. So we have a special setup and a configuration for BTEs, for custom aids and for body aids. And that's all so that we can really try and get the volume and the shape of the ear inside. One of the problems of trying to really measure hearing aid output in a solid 2cc coupler is the natural resonance of the ear. So we know that because the ear is open, that we get this natural resonant peak around 2.7K, and that's the way that our ear hears high frequency sounds. So what happens when you put a hearing aid in an ear? When you put a custom aid in the ear, or all of a sudden you put a BTE ear mould, what happens? You lose the resonant frequency. And so the fitting algorithms always have to add on a little bit more to try and return that resonant frequency, and then add on top of that some gain. Of course, what happened? All of a sudden we started fitting open fit. Now when you fit an open fit product with an open dome, what happens to the resonant peak? It's still there. So it's very important when you're using manufacturers' fitting software that you always try to ensure that the right tubing size and the right dome size are selected. Because if it's open fit, then they're actually not going to turn up the resonant peak very much because it's still there. If it's a more closed fitting like a tulip dome or a custom aid, then of course they have to compensate and add that on into the fitting software. So really ensuring that you've got the right manufacturer's selection is critical in trying to get the right gain in the hearing aid the first time. Then they became a little bit more savvy and they said, okay, what about if we build a standard body? So they developed Kemar. And then they developed an artificial ear with a Swiss-Locky coupler in it. Because what they're trying to do is trying to simulate exactly what happens in the ear with the head shadow and all of the other effects. And they're trying to make it more and more lifelike. Now, when you're doing insertion gain, how far do you put the probe tube into the ear? It's not a trick question. Debbie? A bit further in, that's right. So we know that the problem of sound coming from a thin tube here, be it a custom aid or an ear mould, is that sound's coming from a very small diameter and it's opening up into a large middle ear cavity. And so when the sound comes out, what happens is that little interference waves start to happen. If you don't get that probe tube far enough down, so about 5 millimetres, what can happen is that the end of the probe tube where the microphone is can be in a dead zone. And then all of a sudden you're going, oh, you know, 4K's down. And you turn up the gain on 4K and nothing happens. Has anyone had that happen to them? And you're going, I'm shifting the gain, but nothing's moving. That usually means that you just haven't got that probe tube far enough into the ear canal. I need to bring up response and gain. So if you see something like R-E-U-R, R-E-A-R, then that is what it means is it's an output measure. All right? So an output measure says, I don't care how the sound gets in the ear. What I'm going to do is measure how much sound is at the eardrum. So I don't care if it's resonant peak. I don't care if it's gain in the hearing aid. All I'm really interested in is when it all comes together and it's all summed together, how much is at the eardrum? Because that's what's going to go down further into the ear. When you have something with a G on the end, then we know that such as real ear unaided gain, real ear insertion gain. Gain always says that there are two measurements. It's a difference measurement. So an unaided ear versus an aided ear, you take them away and the difference is the gain. And so when you do insertion gain, it's very tolerant of if you make a mistake, because then you're likely to make the same mistake, aided and unaided, and they cancel each other out. So it's a very forgiving form of verification. When we do speech mapping is REAR. So it is just a total output in the ear. So it's the stimulus plus the gain plus anything else. If I record it on a graph, then you can see here when I do REUR, that with a 65 dB stimulus, that all of a sudden I've got 65, 65, 65, get to the resonant peak, and up it comes and down again. If I graph it in terms of gain, what I'm saying is I'm going to subtract 65 dB, and I'm only going to plot what's above 65. So it's the same graph, it's just a slightly different view. So what does insertion gain tell us? Does it tell us anything about threshold? No. Does it tell us how much of the sound is actually being heard by that person? Well, no, it tells us the difference between unaided and aided. So when you're doing insertion gain, people get very used to just thinking, right, I need 10 dB there and 15 dB there. But it doesn't give you a feel. How is it fitting into the person's dynamic range? Is it above threshold? Are the softest parts of speech above threshold? Is most of the sound coming out just loud sound? Does it have the same modulations of speech? Traditionally, insertion gain is done omnidirectional. You have to turn all the adaptive features off, especially something like the adaptive noise reduction and the feedback canceller. It doesn't tell us how all of the features interact with each other. So how many people in the room would actually send their client out with hearing aids that are omni with no features turned on? Hands up. None of you. All right, because modern hearing aids are very developed. They have a lot of adaptive features. The problem is that once you start adding adaptive features on, you don't know how they're interacting with each other. It always has some effect on the frequency response. And you can't tell that unless when you're testing and you're verifying the output, that everything's turned on. It's actually going to be the program that you send the client out with. Now, remember in the good old days, my good old days anyway, and yours too, Colin? Oh, there you go. That's fantastic. When we used to use pure tones, and we used to mark how loud the sounds were at 500 hertz and 1K and 2K and 4K. So, really we were pretty advanced in those days. And then they decided that, hearing aids, they don't hear pure tones, they actually hear speech. And so they developed speech-weighted noise. Shh, a nice steady state noise, very, very constant output. And then they shaped it like a speech signal. Louder in the lows, less in the highs. And so for a very long time, we've actually used a speech-weighted noise as our part of verification. Remember when I actually had the 3D graph of speech? Did the 3D graph of speech show that speech was like this? No. Speech is variable and modulated. And what that means is that the way that the compressors are working, up and down, the interacting, one sounds loud, one sounds soft, more of this frequency. All right. If you're using a steady state noise, like speech-weighted noise, you're only measuring the compressors at one level. And so that doesn't tell you what happens when it starts to listen to a variable signal. So what we need to do is introduce something that's quite variable so we can really see how all the channels are interacting and how all of the adaptive features are then interacting and what comes out at the end. So we've gone to a lot of trouble so far to develop something that sort of is speech-weighted. And then they thought, we can do better than speech-weighted noise. We can develop ICRA. Has anyone used ICRA in the room? Oh, yes. Is it a nice sound, fan? What do people think of ICRA when you play it? You use ICRA, and the reason why you're using ICRA is because what it's supposed to do is simulate speech. It is the weirdest sound that you've ever heard, and I will try and make it happen here. It was developed by the International Collegium for Rehabilitative Audiology. It has a spectrum that's very much like speech. And I'm going to be using the term LTAS, long-term average speech spectrum, a lot. What it means is that it's not telling me about the peaks. It's taking all of the values over time and giving me an average value of what sound is at each frequency. How much like speech is it? Well, up the top here, what we've got is the long-term average levels of the ICRA sound. So that's where the most energy is, and we can see it's speech-shaped. And then we can see the peaks of the sound up here. So, is there one time when it goes a little bit louder? So we're recording the average value and we're recording the peak. All right, and the difference between those two, the sort of modulation depth that we're talking about, is about 20 dB. Now, when we look at speech, real speech, we can see that the LTAS value and the peak value has quite a lot more modulation difference in it. So although ICRA is much more like speech than speech-weighted noise, and it has quite a lot of modulation happening, it still doesn't have the same modulation depth as real speech. But, we're trying, what we're doing is saying we need something that's not a pure tone. We need something that's more speech-like. And so we're going to a lot of work in developing something that's more speech-like. The rainbow passage, has anyone used that one? It's been around for a long time. The rainbow passage takes a long time to do, and you can either read it out loud if you're doing live speech mapping, or there is a recorded, calibrated version that has a pure tone to start off with. And when you say the whole of the passage, then the proportion of the different sounds of different frequencies in there are pretty much like normal speech. But you do need to do the whole of the paragraph. So that can take you a good, 30 seconds most probably, if not 45 seconds to get through.
20 seconds if you're Scottish.
20 seconds if you're Scottish. Thank you. All right, so when we're looking at speech, we know that speech is very variable and that speech has a lot of components to it. And the major energy of the speech comes from the vibration of the vocal cords. And so when we look at this signal here. We can see that this dark part in the middle, that's the most intense part of the energy and the speech, and that's very much related to the vocal cord movement. This part here, where there's quite a lot of modulations and it's very peaky, that's the changes that we make to the sound based on the way that our lips and our tongue are positioned, if the sound's going into the nasal cavity. So this variation here is sort of what we can do with our mouth. You can see here that the envelope, the speech envelope, travels quite slowly. The variation is quite slow. But the little peaks of the vibration are very, very fast acting. So we need something that's really going to simulate that in fine detail. International speech test signal. Has anyone used it? No? One person? The International Speech Test Signal is something that was developed in Europe. What they wanted to do is that all of the manufacturers got together and researchers from the manufacturers and people like Harvey Dillon as well were involved. And what they wanted to do was have a standardised speech signal, something that really represented speech. And one of the problems is that if you think about someone speaking English, and then you think about someone speaking, for example, Vietnamese or a more Asian language, which is much more tonal and more low frequency. Remember, sometimes you actually set those people up with targets that are English targets. So they can hear English really well. But when they go home, are they listening to English? No, they're listening to Vietnamese. And the shape of the speech is different. So they wanted to get something that was universal, so that each manufacturer, when they're doing their research, that they could refer back to an international standardised speech signal. So they needed it to be reproducible. They wanted it to be very, very similar to real speech. And it had to be international. So, one of your problems that you always have when you're doing speech tests is that it's American or German, and it's really difficult to find Australian speech tests. All right, so what did they do? Well, they got 21 females, that's right. Can you imagine 21 females in one room? And they had 6 different languages, so 6 different mother tongues. American English, well, we had to define it was American English. Arabic, Chinese, French, German and Spanish. And they got the women to record a particular passage. They really tried to make sure that it was a typical sort of speech of the region, that it had the same croakiness and everything else. And then they filtered it down into the LTAS, the long-term average speech spectrum of women, so from about 100 hertz up to 6,000 hertz. And they tried to sort of eliminate any parts of the speech where the pauses were too big. They then got the little scissors out and they chopped up those speech passages into small segments between 100 and 600 milliseconds. They had to be very careful when they cut it up, because you don't want it sort of half a vowel sound. You don't want to sort of break off a t when you've got st together, because that changes the shape of the speech signal. And just really wanted to keep the pauses natural within the speech signal itself. All right, so they've got all of these little snippets of speech. So they picked them up and threw them up in the air. They randomised them. They put a little 1 millisecond shoulder on each end of the speech segment, just to make sure you didn't get any artefacts when it was moving from one segment to another. And then they made sure that each language, the 6 languages, was represented in one segment, and that the order that they were represented was quite different in each following segment. They had lots of combinations of vowels and voiced sounds and unvoiced sounds. They really sort of took a lot of care. These are really good researchers, And the real aim here was, if we're going to cut it up, let's make it as natural as possible. So now when they've put together all of these segments of 100 to 600 milliseconds, what they've done now is created a speech signal that's 60 seconds long. And 60 seconds isn't a very long time. Now, when you're running the ISTS signal, you need to make sure that the first 15 seconds is allowed for the hearing aid and all of the adaptive features to kick in. So you can't just run ISTS for 10 seconds. So the first 15 seconds is very much the hearing aid warming up and starting to perform. And then you need at least 10 seconds after that to really get a more stabilised, representative output. So you do have 45 seconds of the measurement. So 1 minute's not very long. I'm just going to demonstrate it for you. I have to put my visual aids on. So I'm going to choose ISTS. I'll just get rid of some of those traces that were there before. Okay, so we'll do the right ear, we'll do ISTS, and what you'll hear is a calibration tone. So remember when you do your AB words, you have a calibration tone, because it's very difficult to maintain 65 dB or whatever intensity you want from the speech. So what we do is we put the most important, the biggest component of speech, so 1 kilohertz. So you run your 1 kilohertz tone and then you set the value for the output of the speaker. So it will have a calibration tone and then it will start.
And so the good when gave Hause before they should do is that of look at me der lasse go to rapidity salverte. Schalt ein Wing sollte keine than the other. Pinning the box. But on it alla hearing with war. La be obliged the not for it. What it be most Hause could. Finally that's like the Hültermal. Nick the mash of their unique intent. Utas had up more.
It's a pretty weird sound. All right. You can hear a little bit of German. In fact, most people say it sounds like German. You can hear the odd little bit of English in there, a want or a other or something like that. It's a real combination of mishmash, but what it is a real representation of speech. You know, we've gone to all of this trouble, pure tones, speech-weighted steady-state sounds, ICRA, when in fact, why not just use speech? Why bother going to all the trouble of trying to create an artificial stimulus that's like speech? Why not just use speech? So because they were terrific researchers and they really wanted to standardise this speech signal, what they did is they went back and looked at the sound that they created. Because even though they'd gone to all of the steps of trying to ensure that they were taking the snippets out and mixing it together, the real test now is when you go back, is it actually still retained the qualities of normal speech? So they looked at the long-term spectra, the short-term spectra, the fundamental frequencies, the co-modulations. They looked at the percentile distribution. I just want to spend a minute on this because we will come back to it when we talk about percentile analysis. So when we're talking about a percentile distribution, here where it says 30 to 50 is the dark blue. The next level up is 50 to 65. The next one, 65 to 95. And then there's this little top part here, that's 95 to 100. Now what it's done is it's graphed the content of the speech signal. So it's accumulated all of the values of each frequency along the way, because sometimes you'll have some parts of the speech that are very soft, and then another part of the speech which is very loud. And so it adds together all of the ongoing variations, and it says how much of the signal was very soft and only occurred about 30 to 50% of the time. All right? So this tells me that there is a lot of this speech here that has very soft components only in it. And then it says, all right, let's see what proportion of the speech signal, how many times at this frequency was it between this level and this level. So in terms of 55 to 65% of the time, the speech signal, the speech component, sat at this intensity. All right? 65 to 95% of the time, and so that's pretty much the LTAS most probably. 65 to 95% of the time here, the signal was that loud. And of course, when you're looking at peaks, you're really expecting that the peaks really won't occur very often. And this is very much, most of the sound here is really only happening 5% of the time. So it's a way of us looking at the modulation components within the speech signal. How many times is it down here? How many times is it up here? But we know that in speech, because the vibration is the loudest part of speech, that most of the vibration, most of the time, it's going to hang around the middle. So what they did is they had a look to see how much this ISTS signal looked and compared to a normal speech signal. And they thought, we've done a really good job. So we've talked about probe placement. So why was it important in insertion gain to have the probe just past the out part of the custom aid or of the ear mould? Why was it important that it was 5 millimetres past it? Because if we didn't get it 5 millimetres past, it's possible we were in a dead zone. When we're doing an REAR measurement, and that's what speech mapping is, it's real ear aided response, it's a total measurement, we only have one go at it. Whereas insertion gain was very forgiving. If you have an error in the unaided and you have the same error in the aided, they just subtracted from each other, so it wasn't a problem. But now that we're going to do an output measure, a single measure, we need to make sure that we do it properly. When you look at the adult ear, all right, we know that the average ear canal size, well, it's about 24 millimetres. And then the outside part here of the ear canal to the tragus is about another 10 millimetres. What we want to do now, though, is ensure that whenever we place our probe, that we place it deep. All right, so we're coming back to this one here, and what you can see is the sound's coming out of the sound bore, and we have these little interference patterns here, and it travels down the ear canal, and it hits the eardrum. And what happens when it hits the eardrum? Does it disappear? Some of it bounces back. All right. And so when sound comes down out of the hearing aid, hits the eardrum and bounces back into the oncoming sound, We call it reflective interference. So that has real implications now for when you're doing your verification. So the sound is going down, it's hitting the eardrum, it's bouncing back, and it's interfering with the sound that's coming in. So just like before, when we had to make sure that we had our probe microphone really past that opening to avoid the dead zones, now we need to make sure that the end of our probe microphone is within 6 millimetres of the eardrum. So if you don't actually insert your probe tube far enough, you get into a dead zone. So how are you going to measure 6 millimetres from the ear? It's a bit scary for some people. All that you need to do is get a ruler, measure 28 millimetres, make a little mark. And I say 28 because what I like to do is have the mark not at the entrance of the ear canal, but just in line with the tragus, because it's much easier for you to see it when you've got a hearing aid in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to insert the probe tube right down so that the tragus is in line with the mark. And that, on average now, will be 6 millimetres from the eardrum. Of course, if you have a larger ear, like a man ear, then you're most probably looking at 30. So when I'm with clinicians and we're doing some verification, and we press go, and we look at what's happening in the output, and all of a sudden, 3 and 4K are down a little bit, the first thing they want to do, you know what the first thing is? They want to go to the fitting software and turn up the gain. And I go, no, the first thing that you need to do is get your probe tube and push it a couple of millimetres more into the ear canal. Because chances are you've actually landed it here instead of down here. So the first step, whenever your high frequencies are down, is just push it in a little bit more. I did go to a conference recently and I was talking about speech mapping, and one of the clinicians there was telling me that they use the bump and back method. Now, I'm not recommending the bump and back method, but what that person was doing was inserting the probe tube deep into the canal, and when the client went, oop, the clinician said, it's just in the right position now, and so waved it off. Has anyone had a probe tube bump on their ear, their eardrum? One person. I can tell you that I have had it done many times because I let people practice on me, and it's most probably a good idea if you actually do it as well, because when it hits the eardrum, it's a bit of a loud sound, it's a bit of a oh, but it isn't actually going to do any damage. And I think clinicians get really scared about trying to insert the probe tube too deeply. But if you don't do it properly, you won't get the right reading of output. So measure 28 millimetres all the way down the ear, stop at the tragus. If 4K's down or 3K's down, push it in a little bit more. So normally, rather than doing the 28, I always go a couple more millimetres, just to be sure, because I want to get it right the first time. So this is something that's really important and will really affect your output. So the live speech mapping screen, and we're talking live speech mapping now, not talking speech mapping, we're talking live speech mapping. And I think that a lot of the time when this sort of equipment and this technology came out, that people only really heard about live speech mapping. And they thought, well, my voice is different to this person's voice, this is a man's voice, this is a woman's voice. Obviously, it's not worth doing. So there are times, and we're going to talk about some of the times when you might like, and when you might find using live speech mapping a great tool for counselling or for setting up some special programs for people. Now, on the live speech mapping screen, what you have is the threshold, you have the UCL, the uncomfortable listening level. And now we have the full dynamic range of hearing of that person. And we have our speech banana in here. So speech at 70 dB at 1 millimetre from the person. When we have a hearing loss like this, you can see that the dynamic range here in the high frequencies is much more limited than it is in the lows and the middles. So now when we go to calculate the change, when we're really looking at the output of the hearing aid in the ear, what can the person hear? It's now transposed into a different format. So on this screen here, we can see that now this is the threshold. So the threshold here has been converted to dB-SPL from dB-HL, and now it's the other way round. So this is threshold, this is now the UCL, and this is the dynamic range of the person. And what we've done is because of the compression that's going to be needed over here, that we have to modify the shape of the speech banana. And so it's modified now here in this picture, and it just depicts the sort of true value now of speech in a limited dynamic range. I often find it a good counselling tool to use just purely unaided speech with a client. So what you can say to the client is, this is your hearing. You only hear things that go above this line. And so now when I'm talking or when your wife's talking, guess what? You can only hear this much. This is the part of the sound that you can't hear. I've also seen clinicians use it in terms of encouraging people to actually accept more and more gain. So when you first, fit a person, you're going to be underfitting them, is that right? How many people, when you do any sort of verification and you've got your targets, how many people do you send out of the door, new users, on those targets? You don't. So we always, especially with new users, we're under-amplifying them. So what you can say to the client is you can give them a visual picture of what the hearing aid's doing. That you can see how much sound and where the hearing aid's turned it up. There'll be parts of the sound where the hearing aid isn't quite even reaching threshold. So they might come back in 2 weeks' time and you'll turn it up another dB or two. And you can go, oh, look where we are now, we're nearly there. And then in 2 weeks' time you can come back and turn it up again. So they become an active part of the process. And in seeing that they actually are getting closer and closer to where you, as the clinician, really do want the aided amplification to be. So now if you're going to use live speech mapping, you've got your threshold, you've got your UCL values, and what you would do is you would use some soft speech. So you would use soft speech here, and you would try and make sure that that soft speech was audible. All right? So if someone's using 50 dB speech, you want to make sure that the hearing aid's actually turning it up above their threshold. When you're using ordinary comfortable level speech, say 65, what we want to do now is ensure that that 65 dB output, it sort of sits on the top part of the modified speech banana. And when the client is listening to loud speech, what you want to do now is make sure that none of these peaks are going to go above the UCL of the client, because we know then it's going to be really uncomfortable. So you would do 50 dB of speech, you would do 65, and you would do 80, and you do that by looking up here and monitoring your voice level when you're talking. 50, 65 and 80. What does that remind you of? Insertion gain. All right. So, but here, when you're using live speech, we're actually not utilising it in terms of a target. So we know for OHS that we have a target, be it NAL, NL1. So who uses NL1? NL2? RP? If you've got an old machine, you're most probably using RP. So that when you're utilising it, this is not target driven. This is very much ensuring that it just fits into the dynamic range of the person. So what happens, very often you'll hear someone when they come back for the first 2-week follow-up and they go, oh, the hearing aid works really well, I can hear everyone talking and everything, oh, except my wife. And that's just not selective hearing. But, they're saying, I just can't hear her, it doesn't work for me. And then the wife says, oh, I don't know why he can't hear me. And you go, well, I know why he can't hear you. How easy is it for people to change their behaviour? How easy is it for you to just say, you'll need to talk up louder when you're close to the person? That lasts for 20 seconds and then they forget. So what about if we actually did make a wife program? Not the mute program, but a wife program, all right? If we used live speech mapping, if we got the wife to sit where they normally sit, at home, maybe watching television, so where the wife is sitting and the wife starts to talk, guess what? Now we can say, well, what I'm going to do is modify the gain. I'm going to turn it up. And what I'm going to do is, even though she's only talking at this level, I can now set up a program that will be loud enough for the husband because I'm just going to do it on her voice. Is it important that he hears his wife? Don't smile at me. Of course it's important. And so what you can do is, even though it's not going to be a standardised 65 dB signal, what it is it's ensuring that a very important person in that person's life can actually be heard. Can you do that with insertion gain? No. Because insertion gain just tells you a difference between aided and unaided. It tells you nothing about threshold. And so that's where live speech mapping or speech mapping really comes to the fore, because it relates the output of the hearing aid to the threshold. So we know speech is very dynamic. Here we go. 30 dB, very, very dynamic. And there have been a lot of studies done looking at the difference between one person's voice and another. And what they've found, so, there's the Byrne one here back from 94 that looked at the LTAS and the peak values of different languages and found that really at 4K, there were big differences that were happening between one language and another. They really investigated speech. There are other studies that have looked at standardising. How much different is it in terms of LTAS when we're looking at 300 talkers here? So Byrne and Dillon et al. Did 300 talkers, both male and female, 12 languages, and they found that the standard deviation between 200 and 4,000 hertz was 4 dB. But we do know that different people have different spectra. It's not very different. It's pretty much the same. Okay, so this is where I get a couple of volunteers. So it's better if you don't look at me, because I always pick the people who look at me. All right, so I'm going to start off. Let me just get rid of this one. Tools, delete. So I'm on the right ear. I'm going to be on peaks to start off with. And I'm going to be microphone and start. She sells seashells by the seashore. 1, 2, 3, 4. She sells seashells by the seashore. Oo, e, ah, sh, s. It's a great s, isn't it? So you could actually do a ling test and know what the value was of each of the sounds by using your reference microphone. So I've got this on peaks. Bop, 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 bop. So that you can see that the whole output here is very dynamic. It's very active. There are a whole lot of components. Sometimes the peaks are high, sometimes they're low. Sometimes they're high, sometimes they're low. And then at the end, what I can do is stop, and it says these are the maximum limits, the top peak values at each frequency when I did that. Now, when you're doing something like peaks, because it's moving up and down so much, how easy is it, do you think, to match a target line? It's very difficult. But when might you use peaks? When might there be a time when you can get some value out of using peaks? You know, sometimes when people start talking, your client will go, oh, it's really uncomfortable. And what they're saying is that the peaks of speech have actually exceeded their UCL. And what we can do here is see where the most active parts and the loudest parts and the peaks of speech are. And then we can ensure that we're bringing those levels down on our 80 curve. So in terms of loudness tolerance, that's really where doing something like 80 dB or 65 dB of speech will really give you a really good idea. So if I was talking like this and I was talking, then I would see that 500 hertz had a real peak. So what I might do then is modify the MPO at 500 hertz. But we're never going to be able to meet a target line. If I change to LTAS, and we talked about LTAS before, long-term average speech spectrum. So now you can see that what it's doing is it's averaging. It's not very quick, it doesn't change very quickly. What it's doing is it's just taking where most of the energy is in the speech signal, averaging it out with the other sort of samples before. It's moving up and down reasonably slowly. Up here is where I can try and see if I've got 65 dB. So I'm trying to get it around 65, just up here. And this is a measurement coming from the reference microphone. So when we're going to do targets, we're actually going to use the LTAS on our screen because it's much easier. All right, let me just clear those again. Tools, delete all. Right, microphone. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to count up to 10 and I'm going to try and keep my voice around 65 dB. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, stop. All right. A volunteer from the audience? Oh, come on, you're in the front row. All right, so what I want you to do again is I want you to be coming over. This is the reference microphone that we're recording from. I'm going to get you to count to 10. You'll have to look up at the screen. And what I want you to do is just try and keep your voice at about 65 and then just count, not too quickly, up to 10. Okay, ready, steady, go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, that was a 10. Thank you very much. All right, now I need a boy voice. Come on, Gary, you can do this. That's what I love, is a volunteer from the audience. Thank you, Gary. So let's just see now what a male voice does. How different is the male voice going to be when we're counting up to 10?
You call Gary up there?
Sorry?
You Call Kelly a meal.
I did.
I'll talk to you later.
Okay, you ready? Can you see the VU meter?
Yeah.
Okay, not too fast.
1, 2, 3,
Softer.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Beautiful. Thank you. Wow. Is that you and I that have the same sort of response? So we can see, even in a very crude demonstration like that, even though we've used someone with a male deeper voice, and I've got a fairly deep female voice, and we've used someone with a more high-pitched female voice, that in terms of variation, there's not a lot of variation between one voice and another. I think we all get a bit worried that, you know, if I use live speech for a particular reason, it actually will have no validity.